Good evening, everyone. Hi. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose hosts hundreds of in person events along with our partnered and supported events, trips, and classes, some of which are being held at our branch locations at Union Market and the Wharf. So please visit our website for a full list. Housekeeping before we start. Number one, please turn off or silence your cell phones so as not to disturb the event. For the Q&A after the moderated talk, please remember to step up to the microphone over here by the pillar so as not to so we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation but to also ensure that it is recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them at the registers at the front of the store. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A. So if you'd like to get your book signed, please line up by the pillar once again over here. And then we will come by to ask your name if you want personalization on your books. So please have them ready for us. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So it is my honor to introduce Elizabeth Dias and Lisa Lerer to all of you. Elizabeth is the national religion correspondent for the New York Times, where she covers American religion and politics for more than a decade, with a focus on the surging power of conservative Christianity that drives the Trump movement. She is a Livingston Award finalist and a graduate of Wheaton College and Princeton Theological Seminary. Lisa is the national political correspondent for the New York Times, where she covers American politics, power, and elections for nearly 2 decades. She has covered five presidential campaigns, the White House, and Congress. She was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the Columbia University Journalism School. Tonight, they will be talking about their new book, The Fall of Roe, The Rise of New America. In this incisive work of nonfiction, these two journalists tell us the story of how Roe, one of the landmark decisions of the Supreme Court that gave women the right to abortion, was overturned. In their review of the book, Kirkus Review writes that the book's greatest strength is the author's comprehensive and incisive approach to explaining that Roe did not just fall once on June 24, 2022. Roe collapsed over a transformational decade. Devoid of rhetoric, this even handed work exemplifies outstanding reportage. They will be in conversation with Jess Bidgood. Jess is the host of the On Politics newsletter for the New York Times. She is a veteran political journalist and the guide of all things politics and elections for the New York Times and beyond. Everyone, let us all welcome Elizabeth Diaz, Lisa Lerer, and Jess Bidgood.
Hello. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to hear these two brilliant journalists talk about a very brilliant book. I am lucky to know them and lucky to read them. So you two write that the political tale we have uncovered is explosive. But the story of the fall of Roe is also a deeply human one, bound up with foundational questions of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The battle over abortion is not just about whether a woman can end a pregnancy. It is about what it means to be a woman in America. It is about the power of belief and the potency of denial. And it is a story of a nation fighting over what it wants to become. What you have done here is craft the first detailed account of how Roe fell. It's a significant journalistic investigation, not only of how the anti-abortion movement took down this legal precedent, but of how the left failed to see that was happening and failed to stop it. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you all for being here tonight. It's really lovely when you write a book. You dream of the moment when you can actually talk about everything you've been doing for 2 years with people like you. So thanks for giving us your Monday night. We spent 2 years on this investigation, and ultimately, what we found is there's a network that many Americans actually probably didn't know about that worked for a very long time, finding innovative ways, legal strategies to use American law, politics, and then law to transform the culture and ultimately take down Roe. And so we kind of chart this how they did this, and the chessboard that they made the country when no one really was looking. And through it all, we really found that abortion, yes, it's about this procedure itself, right? It is about this concrete thing. But perhaps even more than that, abortion is a symbol for so much in America. And it was that symbol that this network of conservative, mostly Christian lawyers, activists, and politicians worked to change, because they had one vision of what womanhood and family, marriage, childbearing should be like in this country. And it was a conservative Christian vision ultimately pitted against a liberal feminist one.
And I think another thing that this story really showed us is I think we think of political change as happening in this one way, right? People, the country changes, public opinion changes, they pressure elected officials. Those elected officials then push through laws that reflect the change in the culture. And what this story is a really different one, right? The people who wanted abortion banned in all forms are a distinct minority in America. Now they're about 8% of the country. Before it was what, like 12? It was under 15. It went down a little bit after Roe fell. But they were able to push this change through by figuring out ways to sort of leverage power in American life, either through gaining control of conservative statehouses, gaining key spots, in judgeships, and obviously on the Supreme Court. And it shows that, and by sort of gaining power, they were in effect able to change the culture. So it shows that political change can happen in this other way too. And I think that's a really sort of interesting part of our politics right now.
It is. And so this is a serious political book, but it is also like a really good read. It has characters. It has
That's what you go for,
and it has a really broad scope. And so I'm wondering if you can talk with us a little bit about the scope of this book. It takes place in Washington, but also around the country. Why tell it this way, and why tell it with this wide aperture?
So I think, to what Elizabeth was saying before, the thing with abortion is yes, it is about if a woman can terminate a pregnancy, how many weeks she can do that with, and all those kinds of things. But it also looms so large in American life as this symbol of religion and health and, women's rights in the country. And it encompasses so in terms of how we think about abortion and how the force that abortion is in our politics, which I think we've all seen really clearly post-Roe, it looms a lot larger. And part of the reason that is, I think, is also because the intimacy of this. This is something that people just understand. If you've had a baby, if you know someone who've had a baby, if you have been a baby, you understand, how this sort of works, at least in the roughest terms. And so we felt to tell this story only in kind of the Washington way, and I say this with no pejorative nature towards this fine, fine city, in the halls of power, in the, Supreme Court and in Congress and in state houses, you'd be missing out at this really essential thing about this issue, which is that intimacy. So we really felt it was really important to be in those rooms. And so a lot of our reporting took place in June 2022, which of course was the final month of what we now call the Roe era, because it turned out Roe, like many other things, was in fact a distinct era in American life. And we tried to get in the places where the people impacted by this were. So we capture the last abortion in a state where it becomes banned. We got inside a pregnancy crisis center, which is, of course, the anti-abortion centers that offer non-medical grade ultrasounds that are pretty hard to get access to from a reporting perspective. So we were proud of that reporting for sure, to try to give the full picture of what this issue is and what it really means for people and means in American life and American politics.
And I'd just add we felt it was really important to understand the stories of the people who were working to make this change happen, like especially their own biographies in terms of pregnancy, kids, and spirituality. So we spend a lot of time like getting to know the players that I'm sure many of you have heard of, like Leonard Leo, but from an understanding of the issues that actually most shape them as people, right? And in their personal, the deepest part of their personal lives, which is their, in these cases, relationships with their kids and with their faith.
And I want to linger on that point for 1 second, because one thing that really struck me about the book was the network that was working to overturn Roe was sort of so broad and so like complex that there were people in it who didn't really realize what they were part of. They didn't really realize they were in it. Can you tell us a story of one of those people?
Sure. So I'm thinking of a nurse in Mississippi named Becky Curry, who worked as a nurse for a long time and then ran for state house, became a state representative. And she told us in the reporting kind of her own story about why she decided to introduce a bill in Mississippi that ended up becoming law, banning abortion at 15 weeks. And this, of course, became the case that ended up as the Dobbs case in the Supreme Court. So this is the woman who got the law, right, in the state house to begin with, to even trigger the chain of events that would send it up to the Supreme Court. And she, we were down there in Mississippi, and she was telling this story, as she often has told in local public settings, about what motivated her. And she talked about being a nurse in the hospital years ago, and she talked about delivering. There was a premature delivery in a crisis situation that happened at about 14 or 15 weeks. And it was such a dramatic moment for her. And she tells the story of watching the end of that pregnancy and the fetus, be delivered. And she talks about watching its heart stop beating. And she says, this is why we want to ban abortion at 15 weeks. Well, what we had also reported was the work of the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a major legal conservative Christian group that is behind a lot of the cases that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. They argued the FDA case about the mifepristone or the medication abortion pill earlier this term and lost. But unbeknownst to her, they had been drafting model legislation, having already decided in their legal world that if they thought, if we can pass a bill somewhere in this country ending abortion at 15 weeks, that would be the sweet spot legally to be able to trigger a case that could undo Roe's viability line at the Supreme Court. So they had prepared this language and worked with an ally of hers to basically get it introduced. So they had come to her with this, but she didn't realize that she was the end of that chain. She just thought, her lobbyist, conservative Christian lobbyist friend was bringing this bill, and it was going to be drafted and based off of her own vision. So it was fascinating to hear these, like, even someone who sees herself and is in many ways the central force, like this woman who got this bill passed to end up overturning Roe, didn't understand the huge scope. And essentially, as some people have talked about her, she ended up being a pawn in the system, even though it aligned with her own goals.
It's remarkable reporting. And another notable thing about this book is that you also tell us the story of the left, not just the right. You switch perspectives, you braid both stories together. Tell me a little bit how you thought about showing those both sides of this story.
Yeah, what we found when we sort of, when you start a project like this, you try to read everything that had been done. And what we found was, like, these stories actually hadn't been told together in it was really unusual in a way. And we felt like you couldn't see this whole picture. You couldn't tell the complete narrative of how Roe fell if you didn't tell both sides. So we really tried to dig into what was going on with Democrats and the left during that period. And what we found was, I mean, pretty much this pervasive sense of denial, this disbelief in a lot of quarters that Roe could go. And in some ways, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like something that's been in American life for 2 generations, it feels unmutable in a way, right? It's hard to imagine that that could suddenly disappear. So I think for a lot of voters, that's how they felt. And that explains a lot of the shock that we saw when Roe finally fell. And then there was this other sort of related political dynamic to that, which is like nobody really goes out there to fight for the status quo. It's like not much of a rallying cry. So the anti-abortion forces were fighting for change, and that was a more powerful force in the politics than people who wanted to preserve Roe and preserve abortion rights. So when Democratic campaigns looked at this issue, they said, sure, it helps with the base in some measure, but this is not the thing that really gets our people off the sidelines or gets these critical, independent, undecided voters that those of us in our political reporting business are also obsessed with. This is not the thing for them. So they talked about it, but talked about it in passing, in a way that now feels so foreign because now it's like so much of what Democrats talk about in their campaigns. But these two things sort of intertwined and made it really difficult, even for the people who saw what was happening, to sort of get people energized and spread the word about that. And then, of course, Trump gets these 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, which no president since Reagan had gotten. And at that point, it's really difficult for Democrats to stop this at all. So it is a story of denial and then, I guess, of missed opportunity in some ways.
And you describe the left being in denial. Had they not been, was there more they might have done, they might have been able to do to stop this? Was this stoppable?
It's a really difficult question, and it's one we thought a lot about, right? Like, you can't control, it turns out time waits for none of us. So it would have been very difficult to control the situation on the Supreme Court, right? Like, that is something that's beyond even the control of politics. I do, there's some in the final sort of months of Roe, right? There is a question of whether they were preparing people and raising alarms loud enough about what was to come. And they certainly were trying, but in terms of stopping this, I mean, in some ways, it also reflects the party, right? A lot of people, you hear a lot, well, when Democrats controlled everything under Obama, they should have codified Roe, made Roe federal law. And in fact, what's really interesting about that point is Democrats did not have enough Democratic votes to do that. Like, there were so many anti-abortion Democrats in the party that they couldn't have done that even if it had been a priority to do so, which it obviously was not. So it's really hard to see some magic way that they could have stopped this. I mean, part of this is a little bit of asymmetrical warfare. I think Democrats thought of this issue and, abortion rights organizations in a lot of ways in electoral cycles, right? If we elect more senators that support abortion rights, then we will secure it and we will be okay, right? The right will be protected. So it's a 2-year cycle, it's a 4-year cycle. And when you look at the anti-abortion movement, they're thinking about this in generational terms, right? It's a much longer, and still I think we see that now when we look at things like IVF or some forms of contraception, that there's some discussion on the fringes of that movement about restricting. They're just looking at it in such a longer time frame, in part, I'm sure what my religion reporter co-author would say, because of the religious roots of that movement and how far that stretches back. So in some ways, it's hard to even compare the way the two sides approached it, because it's just the frame is so different, I think.
And there was, you wrote about this real sense of shock that I think rocketed around the country after the draft was leaked and then Roe actually fell. The two of you cover politics, Lisa, Elizabeth, you cover religion. Were you too shocked?
We were not shocked.
We were not shocked.
Actually, the origin story of the book, we had worked together on and off when we were both at the Times. We joined the paper around the same time. We were both in the Washington Bureau, and we had done a story, we had both followed the restrictive laws. We had done a story in 2019 that sort of looked at the increase of state restrictions and how the left and the abortion rights movement was or was not responding. And so when they had oral arguments in the Dobbs case, we listened to it on the phone together. And
Opposite sides
on
of the
opposite
country.
sides, I was in New York and you
I
were
was
in
in
Arizona.
Arizona.
And there was this moment that we both remember, which was when Justice Barrett talked about safe haven boxes, which, like, some of you in this audience certainly may remember, right? But those are these boxes that if you have a baby and you don't want the baby, you can like drop the newborn off in a box in front of a fire station or a community center and it'll be adopted. And the argument that Justice made was basically like, well, there's all these safe haven boxes in all 50 states. So why do you need abortion? You can just have the baby and leave it in the box and it'll be adopted and it's fine. And at that moment, we don't remember who, but one of us said to the other, oh, they're going to do, this is done. This is over. They're ending Roe. I don't know what form that's going to look like, but it's over. So we knew it was coming. I think what I was surprised by was the scale and the duration of the political backlash. Like, it scrambled the politics so intensely, so quickly, and it's been so sustained. And I'm not sure I would have predicted that level of response.
Right. Roe was such a foundation of our politics for half a century in a way that many people didn't understand, just that it was the foundation, right? It just was something that was there. It was taken for granted. But the political dynamic then for the last half century had been that Republicans were able to use abortion as a motivating force for their base. And this is right now, we're in the middle of, nearing the end actually, of the first presidential election without Roe in 50 years. And so we're watching in real time, once that foundation shattered, like what is being remade in its place.
And look, like, I'm sure in this town, in this audience, people could name like 10 different Supreme Court cases. But in other places, people can't name a lot of cases, but one that they can often name is Roe. Like, this was something that people knew, that they were familiar with. And when it disappeared, I think it was quite shocking.
Now, part of this book takes place in a world that might feel foreign to many in this audience: conservative, Catholic, evangelical politics, religion, and culture. Is that a world that's foreign to the two of you?
Oh, no. No, this is my jam particularly. I actually went to seminary. I went to Princeton Theological Seminary for my master's while I was becoming a journalist. And I've written for most of my career actually about the right, the conservative Christian movement, evangelicals and Catholics, and being in spaces that are actually quite familiar to many, many, many Americans, but that they also feel don't get represented as often in maybe towns like this. So it was being able to track their vision and cultural sentiment, their deep values, deeply held beliefs over time. That was really valuable for the reporting. And even more than that, I just think religion can be like a language in many ways, right? It's just an entire world that is inhabited, and the familiarity with that, like we really don't think you can understand our current politics right now, certainly not how Roe fell or everything that is at stake going forward, which is a lot, which we can get into, without understanding the deep religious, but specifically conservative Christian underpinnings of this, right? These are communities that when they think about the story of their lives today in this present moment, will talk about themselves like with a story of 2,000 years ago, right? The events of the life of Jesus, particularly, and the virgin birth at the center of that story is just so foundational for thinking about what it means to be human, the meaning of suffering, and what should and shouldn't be valued in life in any time.
And I think particularly for this topic, for this story, like, you can't just tell it as a political story. And actually, so our book, we do the final decade of the Roe era, and we start in 2013, right after President Obama was reelected. And it's this moment when the Republican Party conducts this autopsy of what went wrong and why Romney lost. And one of the things they decide, of course, is that social issues like abortion are losers for them, and they need to reach out to more women and voters of color. And we start at that point because it's the moment when the anti-abortion movement told us was their lowest point. And politically, it's when they're at most peril of being cast out of the Republican Party. But it's also the point at which conservative Christians become a minority in American life.
White Christians.
White Christians, yeah. A slight minority, right? It's not a dramatic minority, but in the 90s, they were like 66% or something, plus or minus a supermajority. And at this moment, they become a slight minority. And those things are intertwined, right? That they feel that they're under assault, that they're losing their place in American culture. It's also a moment when same-sex marriage is moving towards getting legalized. So the culture is changing in ways that felt concerning for that community. And so you can't tell this, and abortion was a thing that they could sort of lean into. And you can't tell the political story without telling that other story, which is, in fact, a religious story.
And now, in just a moment, I'm going to ask you all if you have questions for Elizabeth and Lisa. And there is a microphone that, for some of you, is hiding behind this post here. But you should feel free to line up behind it. But before we go to audience questions, I just wanted to ask, one thing that you make very clear from the book in your reporting is that this is not this is the beginning, not the end for the anti-abortion movement. What is next for the right?
We know that this is a movement that saw the fall of Roe as not, as you said, not the end, but the beginning of the end, right? Their goal is to eradicate all abortion, that they see it as a moral wrong, and they see their cause. They often compare their cause to the civil rights movement. So this is a movement that wants to go further. Now, and we've seen some movements, as I'm sure a lot of you all are aware, efforts to restrict access to IVF or restrict access to medication abortion, which now accounts for a majority of abortions in America. There's some talk about some forms of contraception and restricting those. The problem for them is that the politics have scrambled so intensely. And what they had before was this pervasive, as I said before, sense of denial. So they could operate in a way that the public either didn't fully see or didn't fully sort of internalize what was going on. And now I think there's just much broader awareness of what's happening. And there are very few issues in American life, particularly now, that have vast majority support. And fertility treatments and access to contraception are two of them, where it's 80% of people are in favor of those things. So I do think it's gotten much harder for the anti-abortion movement to move forward with things that they want to do. But that does not mean that they don't want to do those things, right?
Oh, and I'd add, the story of how Roe fell is a story about a minority winning and how that works, right? It actually does not take a majority to change history. In fact, sometimes, as in this case, it's an extremely dedicated minority, not just a 40% minority, but a much smaller minority that figured out how to pull the levers of power as part of this long-term strategy. So, and then the other thing is that, yes, this was about abortion. There's rolling back or ending Roe was the beginning to advance other policies and restrictions about reproductive health. But this is really part of a broad-scale effort to roll back the sexual revolution itself. And what we're seeing in some of our reporting, some internal documents that we have from the legal groups that we're working to end Roe, and what we're actually seeing play out now in the states is attempts to restrict expanding rights for transgender people, whether that's through access to healthcare procedures or parental rights in schools. So there's all kinds of ways. Religion in school. Remember, we're seeing the Ten Commandments everywhere, right? This is all part of restoring. This is Make America Great Again, right? This is what that looks like, which is really about, now the Roe era is over. We're entering a new era, which is in part reestablishing or bringing back some of the things that were from the what the culture and politics looked like before the Roe era, but it's also something new. So it's valuable to keep this story of how change actually happens in mind when we're looking even at things like the Supreme Court decisions, right? Like the FDA, there were 2 major abortion cases this term, the FDA case about medication abortion, access to medication abortion, and a case about emergency treatment for abortion for pregnant women in emergency situations, in a case that came out of Idaho. And both of those the court essentially punted on, which it could be seen as on the surface, oh, look, this is a big win for the left. But actually, when you think about how the anti-abortion movement operates, they have a long time horizon. So what they did, like with Roe, was learning, okay, what legal tactics are not successful, right? Like, how do we move this forward? So what can look like a loss in their calculus is actually a long-term win.
Like a learning
It's a
experience.
learning
It's a learning
experience. And even
experience.
now, like the end of the term, we had the Chevron case, which is going to, we were talking with anti-abortion activists as soon as that one came down, and they're thrilled because they think by the time that they can get another case like the FDA case back to the Supreme Court, the new Chevron ruling and the way it changed how the authority of regulations will work, that will give them a totally new runway, open door to achieve some of their goals.
And of course, and then you got questions. There's no magic wand here for Democrats, even if Biden wins again and they get majorities in the House and the Senate. They need they need 60 votes to codify Roe, and it's hard to imagine them getting that kind of a majority. Or they have to get rid of the filibuster, which is also hard to see a clear pathway to doing that, although I suppose that could be more possible. So there's no magic wand that like the next Democratic administration can wave and Roe magically comes back, despite what President Biden seemed to say in that debate last week. So this is a long road. And when I talk to abortion rights groups and activists, and I have asked them, okay, it took 50 years for Roe to go. How long does it take to get some form of federal abortion rights back if it comes back? And, that's an unknowable thing I'm asking them, but nobody's telling me 2 years, right? They're saying 10 years, 20 years. I mean, who knows? It's not knowable, but it's not, the horizon seems longer. This is not an issue that's suddenly going to be like solved and disappear. I think it's something that's going to sit with us in our politics for quite an extended period of time.
Absolutely. It's an issue that Democrats can run on, are running on, and are winning on in many cases, but they're not actually laying out a plan to restore Roe quickly, because there isn't such a thing. And on that weighty note, let's go to audience questions.
They only need 51 votes to approve a new Supreme Court justice. Keep that in mind. I was born during the New Deal. I am a New Deal Democrat. What the Democrats did wrong was they ignored the Supreme Court for far too long and allowed all these horrible people to get on the court. My question is different. I'm interested in the New America part of the title of your book. My understanding is, or my sense is, that it's Tim Alberta said that, you know who he is,
Yes.
talked about the fact that his father was a pastor, and when he went to church and they were celebrating something, there were more American flags than there were crosses. That it's not just evangelical people thinking about religion, maybe not at all about religion. My question is, it seems to me that what happened was the right, the old Republican business deregulation, low taxes party picked up the Southern strategy, and then they picked up abortion, kind of through what's his name, who runs the Christian school in West Virginia, the case about, I forget what it's called, but
Liberty?
they required that, they said they couldn't segregate the college.
Oh,
and he took that to the court, and he lost. And that those people realized that abortion was another social issue, and the business community, which doesn't care about abortion one way or the other, got behind it and used the social issues to drive the politics and the Supreme Court. The deregulation decision is what they have wanted since 1935.
So I'll let Elizabeth handle the religion point of this and how politics has changed the church. But what I will say is what you're describing is the anti-abortion movement of the 70s and the 80s.
Yes.
Yes. And you're right about that. It started out as being, a way to push back on the forced desegregation of schools, right? But I think what we document is how the movement shifted over this final decade of the Roe era. And what we saw during this period was a radicalization. And in part, it's because the movement was so intertwined, it was so foundational to Trump winning, right? Like they stuck with Trump when these moderate Republicans and other Republicans jumped ship. It was the Christian, really evangelical base that stuck with him. And they became intertwined in that MAGA movement to the point where it's hard to separate now, for me at least, when I think about that, to separate out those two identities. And so I think what we show that you saw was a radicalization of the anti-abortion movement along with the shifts in the Republican Party. In some ways, Trump expanded like the Overton window of what Republicans would and could consider doing. And I think the same thing happened with the anti-abortion movement. And it's useful to remember, like when we start our book in 2013, a lot of Republicans and anti-abortion activists did not think Roe could fall. It felt inconceivable to them. And over this decade, their horizon shifted. And Trump is sort of how Trump transformed the Republican Party is really like interwoven in that story. But I don't know, on the church piece, I'm going to.
One of the major plot lines of the last decade too, which you're getting at here, is that we're not just talking about religion influencing politics. Politics is changing American Christianity itself. Like it is becoming something new. And so we're seeing that really all over the place with the rise and intermingling of the MAGA movement with the edges of what was what considered old evangelicalism in America.
Right.
And it's in the Catholic Church, absolutely. So when I think about, and when I think the paper, a lot of us at the paper are thinking about how we cover this now, we have to think about it as some kind of new political religious movement that is it's changing. I mean, you hear this from people in churches all the time, people leaving their churches because of the way that they don't recognize their faith anymore. So thank you.
Like Tim Alberta.
Thanks for the question.
Hi. So this is kind of a ringer question because I work for a reproductive rights group. But one of the things that I've been digesting a lot, reading your book and thinking about this movement a lot is the ways in which contraception and IVF have been attacked in the same time frame. So looking back to 2013 and going forward, those used to be the places where there was a framework for bipartisanship around contraception. IVF, I think, because it's not typically covered by insurance, maybe less so in the public sphere. But again, sort of a universal agreement around those things. And I think you're absolutely right that the same anti-abortion groups have an agenda around those things, and it's pretty radical. What I'm interested in is the degree to which you think they are following almost a similar path leading up to Roe. It's sort of death by a thousand cuts. It's not we're going to ban a contraception. It's we're not going to allow Medicaid to cover this method and this method because we have a religious definition of when life begins that is different from medical science. How do you see sort of the lack of maybe public awareness that that's really under threat, dovetailing the lack of public awareness about the threats to Roe leading up to it? I'd just be curious, having spent 2 years of your lives digging into this.
No, we really appreciate the question, and it's something we notice and talk about a lot now. It's why we try to say to readers, if you understand the story of how Roe fell, you will have the tools to understand what is actually happening now, because it is very hard to see in the moment. And we're noticing this even with how they're talking about IVF right now. And, it comes up, you can, like, I think you're correct. Like, as you're saying, you can track, not quite there are some differences, and also the foundation has changed. But the way that, let's talk about, like, let's build an ethical argument over here, and let's look at the healthcare piece of this over here, and let's build this organization over here. It's always this long-term generational thinking. And so that's why things that seem like they're on the fringe at one point are easy to dismiss. Like, oh, that's just a fringe group. But what's actually happening is a new foundation is being built, right? So that all the pieces will be there, should they be able to find a way into power, to affect change. I mean, we see some of this happening out in the open, right? There's many of them are saying what they would hope to do with the 2025 project, when it comes to reproductive rights.
But I do think, like, that issue of the foundation changing is really important. The politics are really different now, right? And I think people are more aware than certainly they were, when this final decade of Roe. And also, like, I mean, IVF and fertility treatments are not abortion, right? Abortion always, people was sort of this, like, there was always a majority support for some form, for Roe, for some form of federal abortion rights. But there was this sense that this was something like toxic or complicated, and people do have complicated and often nuanced views about abortion, which sits, as we said, at this, like, nexus of a lot of feelings of religion and upbringing and medicine and all these things. And I think IVF is different. Right? I don't think people have as much, there's not as much, like, angst about it. There's not as much, like, complication for people about it. Like, I think a larger number of people are very supportive of fertility treatments and don't feel this kind of, perhaps feel this kind of, like, complication about it. So I do think, and the same thing with contraception, right? So I do think, like, those are really different. The politics are really different. Public opinion in some ways is different. So there is that piece of it, like, even if they are, and I think they are trying in some ways, the anti-abortion movement, to repeat the same play, like, where they were on Roe is maybe like where they are, I don't know, I'm kind of, like, guessing at this, but where they are in IVF in, like, 1985 or something, like, a few, right? But I think the foundation and the politics at both, like, the essential politics of that issue and also how our politics have changed in this post-Roe era are so different that it's not clear whether it's successful. We don't know,
Thank you for giving me a little bit of hope.
Thank you to you both for being here. As a student journalist, I found this conversation fascinating. So my question would be, now that you're not so deep in the weeds, did either of you have or now have any takeaways you want your readers or audience to learn from your reporting, especially as it seems some of different voter demographics are trending more towards, like, passionate but also fearful of the future of abortion rights in this new upcoming election cycle?
So one thing that I think, first of all, yay, student journalists. Yay. We need you.
Yes,
support. Yay. Yeah, we're happy that people still want to do this crazy thing that we all do. One thing that I am really struck by now as I'm, like, moving into covering the election, that I think people don't fully understand about this issue is, what I'll hear a lot is, like, well, abortion isn't going to be that big a motivator in the election. Look, the economy, when you ask people what issues they find most important, the economy is number one. And then maybe it's, like, immigration, and abortion usually comes in 3 or 4. And I think what people, and the economy is, like, always number one. I mean, I'd like to see the election and the economy is not number one in some form. Cost of living is up there. But I think what people miss about abortion is, first of all, like we were saying earlier, the intimacy of it, and how for this larger number of voters, not a majority, but a larger number, it's really of abortion rights voters, I should say, it's become a litmus test that these people are now voting on this issue and they are going to, like, turn out on this issue. So, like, the power of it politically may not be reflected in this, like, laundry list of priorities that people are giving that puts cost of living and economics ahead of it. that I think it's a little more complicated by that because there's something so intimate and so like essentially like human about it. And now I think part of what's happened with the fall of Roe is when Roe existed, a lot of these conversations were like really theoretical, right? You could be, if you're a politician, you could be pro-choice, you could be pro-life, and you never really had to get into like what that meant, right? It could just be kind of a political rallying cry. And now the whole country has been like plunged in this conversation of like, okay, so what does it really mean to have a miscarriage? What happens if you go into sepsis or you start bleeding out because of your pregnancy? Or how sick do you need to be to require emergency care in a banned state? So like, what if you, I mean, there was an ad in the Kentucky governor's race from a woman who was raped by her stepfather when she was a young girl. Like, this is a messy and like intense conversation that like is inescapable from the lived reality of like of pregnancy and sex and abortion. And so I think that like changes how people think about it in a way that may be hard to capture when you ask them like what the most important issue is, you know? So that's kind of what I think that's something I learned from the book and what I think about a lot now as I, try to cover this really unprecedented election.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to close the line here and ask for brief questions and brief answers.
Sorry.
I'm just curious. By the way, one way we can get the 51 votes is statehood for D.C. But meanwhile, what I'm curious about is more discussion. I love the intersection of politics and religion, your approach. But what about the Catholic Church, and specifically our president, who he himself has said he's had a struggle with this. And, of course, we all wanted him to say more about it Thursday night. So, and also, especially for the young woman, any activism things you can suggest? And when you say the left versus the right, I think it's the pro-abortion. I think it's the whole spectrum. There's certain issues that are really left issues, but I think
you're right. Like the abortion, that's a good point of clarification. Yeah. Abortion rights voters now is a combination of liberals, moderates, and some moderate Republicans as well.
But I'm curious about the Catholic Church more because, you know, traditionally I know growing up with people, I'm Jewish, and abortion was always an accepted, form of, woman's choice. But I'm just wondering how the Catholic Church has shifted, and
It
even
has shifted.
Biden and Biden with it. But does it mean that he doesn't?
The Biden thing I'm going to let Lisa do. But no, the church, one of the interesting dynamics in the church in the U.S. has been the rise of traditional Catholics, kind of a resurgence of the conservative movement within the Catholic Church, the Latin Mass. And I think this is still true, at least it was the last time I checked, but a majority of Catholics actually support abortion rights.
That's what I want to know.
And so again, we're actually in this realm of minority power and what that looks like and who's engaged on the issue and who's not and where the money is and how that's playing out. But it's been fascinating for us to report out a dynamic that's been playing out over this last decade, where on the one hand, you've got a former president who champions himself as the most pro-life president of all time, overturned Roe, who in the past has not has supported abortion rights. So he's not actually been personally opposed to abortion. And then on the other hand, you have
President Biden. I mean, one of the things that is so interesting to me about President Biden is I think he has thought more about abortion than probably like any president in history. Right. Like, this is a man who has wrestled with this. He grew up Catholic. He's still very observant Catholic, and his views have changed. When he entered the Senate, more than 50 years ago, he was not he gave an interview where he said he thought Roe was wrongly decided. And now he really does support abortion rights. He's not always the most comfortable talking about it, certainly not in the terms and the mores of like the abortion rights movement now, but he's supportive of it. And it's really been a fascinating evolution. I think in a lot of ways he's evolved, as he does with like many things, honestly, President Biden, with the sort of center of the Democratic Party, which is now I mean, the idea that there would be an anti-abortion Democrat there aren't any, and it's really hard to there's one, I think, and it's really hard to wrap your head around. So he's shifted on it, and he's very supportive of abortion rights, but he has wrestled with it. I mean, there's no question about that.
Thanks.
Yeah, if Mitch McConnell hadn't stolen those two seats from one from Obama and one from Biden, you guys would have probably been writing a different book if you'd had.
Yeah, we would be writing a different
Democratic
book. Yes.
Appointed justices, and Kavanaugh is a legit justice, but the other two kind of got in because Mitch McConnell was.
They're all
little
on
bit
the
on the
court
crooked side.
now, and I think this is the way that history happened, and it's always hard to know the opposite side. I would also just say, but I would say, I would.
Democrats and
But what I would,
Republican instead of
I
three
understand. But what I would
Republicans.
say to that is the anti-abortion movement wasn't going to stop. That wasn't stopping. Like, I think it was a mistake in a Roe era to count them out.
Yeah, one interesting case that we write about in the book is Whole Women's Health, which was decided in June 2016. So right before that election, right? And while this whole Merrick Garland situation that you referenced was going on. And basically what happened in that case, it was over this Texas law that was the thing. You guys may remember Wendy Davis with the pink shoes, and she had the thing in Texas. So it was the law she protested with the filibuster there. And it was about admitting privileges in hospitals and basically making them stricter for doctors so it would functionally shut down all the abortion clinics, or most of them in the state of Texas. That law also banned abortion at 20 weeks. And when the abortion rights groups sued on that law, they contested the admitting privileges and not the 20-week ban, right? And so we called them and we asked why that choice was made. And they said, well, the idea was that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and they didn't want to set a precedent of, banning abortion at 20 weeks. Like, the court could have decided that they were okay with that. Kennedy was a swing vote at the time on this, and then have to fight that new precedent, especially when they thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and she would get 2, if not 3 justices on the court. And she was probably the strongest supporter of abortion rights that ever really run for president. So the sense was that the country was entering this new era where abortion rights were going to be expanded. So I hear what you're saying, but there's a lot of turning points in history, and I think things can go a lot of different ways,
Right.
But
you're going to have a Democratic president elected in November, and
you think?
Can we get the last question? Because I know we're at 8 o'clock. Could we just? We just want to get one. We're going to move to our last question.
We're going to move to our last question now.
It's already
another
8 o'clock.
question, that is
No,
about
we
the-
only get
We
one
really
question.
wanna hear from
'cause
this
we're
lady.
super
Thank
tight
you.
on time.
I know we'd really like to get one more question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about political framing of the abortion issue.
Yeah.
I have a good friend, long story made short, who retired from being a professor in Kansas. And I remember being on the phone with my old friend Eve Levin. It's like, can you believe that referendum in Kansas on abortion? And it was framed, if I understand it correctly, around freedom rather than rights.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could comment on the sort of potential for bipartisan bridge building around that freedom framing as opposed to the rights framing that many of us.
Yeah, so that was a
espouse.
big shift. And part of what we show in the book is how the abortion rights movement cycled through a number of different sort of things. There was abortion as healthcare, obviously the old sort of pro-choice. And what they really have settled on, and the whole party has settled on in the wake of Roe, is this framing around freedom. And it's been very effective for them. And it's effective for the reasons that you point out, which is that it's not just about getting Democratic voters, but this is now a voting bloc that's Democrats, independents, and some slice of moderate Republicans. We know about 1/3 of Republicans, plus or minus, depending how the question is asked, all the normal polling caveats apply, support abortion rights in some form. And I think the idea that Democrats have is that frame allows them to get those people. I think there's also a sense that it's a frame that President Biden is comfortable talking about the issue in for the reasons that we discussed before. And also that it's a frame that can encompass not just abortion, but all these other things that, could potentially be under threat that we've been talking about this whole time. So yeah, it's polling shows that it's effective. I think the races Democrats have overperformed in just about every race since Roe fell. And so that shows it's effective too.
And now, one final question for me. Abortion can be a scary topic. I know you've mentioned that some media outlets have said it's too controversial for like morning TV. We won't name names. Do you, when we have this book, is this a book to hide on the shelf? Is this a book to not talk about?
No, don't hide your book. Get all your friends to buy this book. Get your book club to buy this book. I think it's less scary now. I think it's people are more comfortable with it. It's funny because there was so much discussion for so many years of destigmatizing, and it turns out the thing that might have destigmatized or changed views in some ways about abortion was it going away. But yeah, please don't hide our book.
And we have a reading guide with more questions for you to talk about it with your friends and book clubs and whoever to keep the conversation going.
Actually,
online.
what I will say is what we both notice is anytime the book comes up or whatever, like in a, maybe a less political audience, one of the things that happens very, very quickly is people they just start telling us about their miscarriages or their pregnancies or or their fertility treatments. Like I know so much about so many people's fertility treatment. I'm here for it. Like you don't write a book like this if you do not want to know all those things. Like how many times did you miscarry? But I think that's different. I don't remember that happening quite as much before Roe fell. And I think that's the point of entry for a lot of people on this topic. And we really tried to write the book in the way you were describing, this very narrative way, with real women's stories where it could be a point of entry for people.
Thank you so much. This is a book people want to talk about, people are talking about. Thank